Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, friends and loved ones, because I welcome all of you back to another Christian Cwiki reading, and we're on to, like I said, sort of like the final stretch for a lot of these, and I kind of felt that even at this stage, there was quite a lot of things that I am very, very openly passionate about that I wanted to speak about more in relation to Chris, and it's kind of sort of why I've saved a lot of these till last, and well, call it a guilty indulgence, ladies and gentlemen, or what you will, but there is something incredibly fascinating about these that even those who, even from Chris's point of view, he could probably see a lot of things in them, perhaps, but how you orchestrate them and how you make them come across is, you know, it's the old adage, ladies and gentlemen, that saying and doing are two very, very different things. So for the next possibly 35 minutes, we're going to be speaking about Chris and his oratory skills. Style has three kinds of excellence: correctness, lucidity, and elegance. For many include the all-important quality of appropriateness, under the heading of elegance. Quintalen on the Education of the Orator 1.5.1. Whether Chris wants to make an argument regarding his opinions, one way he'll attempt to move people is through orating his reasoning onto them. Since Chris lacks some of the basic skills needed to make an effective speech, rarely ever plans out anything he makes, has serious communication problems, and never does research, his speeches always turn out lackluster at best and horrifyingly naive at worst. This could be due to his autism, since communication effectiveness is often affected by it. Now, that may be so, ladies and gentlemen, but that's like whenever you see videos of Chris ever trying to do anything remotely involving having like some enormous announcement. Well, let me explain to you guys why you need to plan things out in that sort of way. Is that now it is true that a lot of videos I make are unscripted. That's absolutely true. Whenever I do need to address my audience on one of my other channels about something a bit more serious, I will do several things at once. I will script down the absolute essentials because I have sort of like this bad habit of constantly thinking that somebody's going to misinterpret what I say. And if it's even by like a single word, I just want people to like understand absolutely where I'm coming from and that I can do absolutely everything in my power to communicate what I say so that there's no cause for concern and everybody is on the same page. That's genuinely quite a good idea. However, most of the times, I sort of know deep down that exactly what I want to say, so I just speak from the heart. And it's always a very good talent, ladies and gentlemen, to speak from the heart, because without the presence of a script, you're letting your audience know exactly what you feel, and sometimes it can be quite difficult to speak almost on the spot. But listen, as somebody who's been doing YouTube for 6 years now, I've gotten very, very good and very, very into the habit of knowing how to address or how to speak so that I can grab my audience's attention, revolve around certain subjects and relating to what I know and also about what I think about what I know. In fact, if you are at all curious, there is a video of some description I do want to show to you guys, ladies and gentlemen, about exactly how this came to be. In fact, actually, how about we do that right now? Let's do that before we go any further. Okay, so I'm gonna chicken out a little bit. We'll cover that later. I think it's just for what they're worth. So here we go, and there is quite a bit to talk about this. So let's start basically from the beginning, which is the beginning. Chris as a public speaker. Chris often struggles to speak in a coherent manner that can convincingly hold an argument. Some of the reasons are as follows: inability to communicate properly. Chris has been known to sometimes have issues making his points clear. His heavy speech impediment, brought on by autism, makes him incredibly hard to understand at times. He also, unfortunately, often seems to space out or lose focus mid-sentence, and repeat a lot of his points when he can't think of anything to say. His orations often include adaptation from other people's or characters' speeches, since Chris seems to have a difficult time being creative and original, and so they often turn out somewhat disjointed and weak. He almost always seems to get it right whenever his speech involves rage or wanting someone to die. Well, possibly because there's no clouding his judgment then. They are exactly as he wants them to be. He almost always... Okay, since all Chris can think about in those speeches is getting his goal accomplished as soon as possible, this indicates a very physically focused style of thinking, also possibly a symptom of his autism, that prevents him from communicating theoretically ideas easily. In many of his speeches, Chris also tends to use fancy-sounding words to make himself look more intelligent than he actually is. Chris seems to think that by using obscure words or by making up phrases composed of existing words and affixes, his speeches mean more than they actually do, and people will think he knows what he's talking about. Unfortunately, however, this often has the opposite effect, especially if Chris is using the word in the wrong way, as he is known to do. And if the person listening to the speech isn't already familiar with Chris's strange vocabulary, they'll be completely lost. Curse ye ha, jerkops, Jane cops. I mean, some of these things are pretty easy to meet Chris halfway on. Some other things are not. Lack of self-awareness. Be the change you wish to see in the world. A quote which Chris should have taken advice from. Despite wanting to change the world, Chris rarely ever seems to attempt to change himself. Whether for good or bad, one of the most important aspects of being a public speaker is their willingness to not only change the ways others think, but to also change themselves. Now, absolutely I agree with this, because to appear attractive and pleasant to a majority audience is not particularly very easy, ladies and gentlemen. Or rather, it wouldn't be particularly very easy if you want to make such a meal out of it. You wouldn't, guys, be able to understand, well, exactly how easy it is a problem can be if you choose to make it easy to do. Like, for example, just learn, okay, I'll share with you guys a very quick story. When I was 13 years old, I had to recite the It's a Dagger scene from Macbeth. And lo and behold, ladies and gentlemen, through constant learning the script, learning the play, the script of the play, constantly practicing, constantly trying, constantly improvising, constantly using stage direction of my own to initiate a dramatic irony and tension, by just doing my homework, practicing and trying, I got there. It's basically acting 101. And you could almost say that being an orator is in part learning how to act. Act like you know exactly what you're talking about and knowing exactly how to win the minds and hearts of your audience. It's so easy to do, in fact, ladies and gentlemen, it's almost stupid. And if everybody was able to come across as that convincing, then basically the whole world would be a stage and we would all be players, according to the famous song. Now, but the problem is that this all comes across as a song and dance for Chris, a tune that he dances whenever he thinks he has anything worth to discuss. You remember a couple of days ago when Chris made an entire video explaining that Hasbro was in cahoots with Putin, despite the fact that all the evidence that Chris found was based on trolls who were flooding the Chris Chan subreddit. It doesn't necessarily, prove that Chris was not passionate. If there's one thing I will say about Chris is that he's certainly full of passion. Well, rage as well as anger are very, very passionate emotions for what they are. But it's also tantamount to the fact that Chris did not take a step back and think to himself, why would a multinational company that a cartoon we produce, which is banned in a certain country, would the leader of said country want to be said, hey look, we could do a good business deal for our current generation of animated products in the form of My Little Pony Generation 5. That's also maybe another issue that, well, despite the fact there's doing research and then there's things that Chris should have just been able to stop and think about from the word go. Because ordinarily, ladies and gentlemen, you would be very open and very passionate and actually very learned about things you were legitimately interested and want to know more of. this makes sense, because why? I would not, like, for example, I would not go all the way to Dundee University, go and see my brother, and then start telling him about how to do his job because I felt like I knew better. I don't know better, and the thought about me knowing better than my own brother is based ultimately only on passion and how I think. So, based on extreme ignorance. And that's sort of a lot of the problems that Chris falls under, because what Chris actually knows about the business deals of presumably his favourite company outside of Sega and Nintendo and Sony, you have to wonder, what was Chris motivated by to do any of these things? And that's why, outside of the fact that, again, Chris doesn't seem to add up the pieces, he is still incredibly easy to deceive and very easy to win over. All you have to do is just convince him in some way with the things he's interested in, and hook, line, and sinker. And by the way, Lawrence Fox and Richard Tice, two very notorious public figures here in Britain, they can draw crowds too, but when you actually listen to what they say, you will pretty much want to start walking away immediately, because they're bad public speakers for different reasons. Therefore, an effective speaker would always be aware of wherever their argument or reasoning falls flat. Instead, Chris, who often speaks and thinks with a somewhat inflated ego, that might be an also other issue, ladies and gentlemen, is that Chris never thought for 1 second to say, you know what, Chris could have solved himself a lot of situations if he just told himself sometimes it's better not to say anything. He is what they call flogging a dead horse, and no public speaker looks good flogging a dead horse. Never looks into his overall character. He tends to treat his good qualities with care and attention, and completely overlooks a majority of his bad ones. The only times he mentions his bad qualities is whenever he feels he needs the pity of people more fortunate than him to make himself feel useful. Because of this complete lack of self-awareness, it is very hard to actually follow any type of advice Chris will give, given his inexperience in these same things. And before people argue the point, the fact that Chris would not know because the type of attention he was receiving for the things he said was so completely out of Chris's range of thought. Well, no. Especially, again, when you think about when Mims and Lucas, they first took pictures of Chris, and then more things came about on ED and 4chan, and Chris did see a lot of them, and for some reason completely got the wrong end of the stick. Like, any person who would have looked at that would have thought to themselves, oh god, is that how people are going to look me as? I better do something about this at once. Because Chris did not do any of this, among other things that he didn't do that he probably shouldn't have, is the fact that, well, the writings, it speaks for itself, ladies and gentlemen, is that all of this is going to play into Chris's idea that he has people who are listening to him, for better or worse. But again, they're not laughing with Chris, they're laughing at him. And, well, yeah. Never doing research. In order to get their point across, a strong orator must know a lot about what they're trying to prove to their audience. You're absolutely the case. You know what? Actors, ladies and gentlemen, for example, they've not only got to know the character they are playing, they've got to know everything about their habits as well, like how do they brush their teeth, how do they do their hair. They've got to be the character, so that, for example, in, let's say, EastEnders, a popular British soap opera, actors will be playing the same characters for days and days and days while shooting. So it means that, for example, Stephen McFadden will be Stephen McFadden one day, and then when for 6 days of the week when he is acting, he is no longer Stephen McFadden, he is Phil Mitchell. He is a long-running criminal kingpin, and he's somebody who rules over a lot of his business assets with an iron fist, and also has a duty of care to look after the children that have been largely affected by his actions, and he is very vulnerable to people deceiving him, such as Sharon Watts. And for anyone who's, again, it could be through EastEnders, it could be Emmerdale, it could be Hollyoaks, it could be Coronation Street. I like to imagine that if I ever got a job, I suppose, as an actor for Coronation Street, I would have to stop being Jimmy Frank one day, and then I would have to be, let's say, I don't know, Fergal Malone for like 6 days of the week, and I'd have to ask myself, how do I know, like, the Websters? How well do I know the Gales? How well do I know the McDonalds? These are the sort of things you have to know, because once you get into a habit, nobody will be able to believe for one moment, even if you're well known, that you are anything other than Fergal Malloy. Did I say Fergal Malloy or Fergal Malone? I prefer Malloy personally, but details. As to why I want to give myself a distinctly Irish name, I'm not entirely sure. A long-running family heritage or something like that. Anyway, where were we? This means doing extensive research on that given topic and evaluating their current stance on the topic whenever contradictory evidence comes to light. Chris, unfortunately, often neglects this part of the process due to bad habits. Well, a lot of people could also say is that Chris's primary goals were not necessarily to be an orator or to be a public speaker, but they were to be a comic book author and writer. But given the fact that we know the problems here and there when it comes to Chris's habits, when it comes to, from an artistic point of view, not necessarily from a writing point of view, we've still got a mountain to climb with that. Because of how little research Chris does to make a point, and having lived a very sheltered childhood, Chris seems to base his points on merely logical fallacies, childlike beliefs, his past experiences, and baseless assumptions. Even when he does do research, the arguments he makes will typically fail due to him misrepresenting or misinterpreting claims made in his sources. Whenever he does research, his preferred source seems to be Wikipedia, which many people do not recommend as a secondary source, given how anyone can edit its articles. Even if Wikipedia itself was a credible source that could be made to make a strong argument, Chris will often cherry-pick whatever proves his point the best, ignoring all of the other parts of the article. Habit of lying. Most importantly, for any public speaker, they need to be someone that can be trusted by the general public. Given how Chris often lies, it is difficult for his speeches to have any credibility, and so lose a lot of their communicative power. The law of non-contradiction and liar's paradox given reasons to disbelieve someone who lies even once. Even examples of his lies, specifically those in his spoken presentations, comprehensive list is found here, oh, trust me, there is, and there's a lot of things to go over with that, are as follows. Chris said that if Blanca Weiss received the medallion and sent it back, this was of course a lie, since Chris had made a new medallion and the old one had been publicly destroyed. Chris made occasional claims that he really doesn't hate gay men, despite several instances of showing otherwise. Whilst technically not lying, Chris's moving of the goalposts when it comes to Liquid Chris's credibility as the true and honest Cwiki is incredibly damaging to Chris's image as an honest and credible person. This includes the Sing Star Challenge. Chris went to great lengths to tell the fans that he would never show gore and violence in his comics. However, he breaks this statement by killing Evan in a very gory fashion in Xanadu issue 10. He later insists his first chat with Jackie that it was justified because Alec gored it up first. Episode 17, which was written long before Aspershoot ever began, ended with Roseju stripping naked, clawing a man's head open, electrocuting him, and leaving him in a puddle of his own blood. And finally, Chris promised to remove himself from the internet, only to return less than 48 hours. I sort of want to go into a little bit more about this when we get into Chris's lies in a separate video, because whilst not necessarily the worst sins he's committed through lying, it becomes a pattern of sorts. Common traits of Chris's rage, or his speech I should say, rage. Chris has often had a very black and white view of people, and evil tending to view people as his enemies. If he doesn't like them, even if the situation is vastly more complicated, of a vastly more complicated nature, this and his lack of tact when it comes to his stronger emotions, be they love or hate, unfortunately caused Chris to lash out at people with insults, death threats, and obscenities. This behaviour even got C-Chan Sonichu YouTube taken down at one point. The extent of what Chris might say to his offenders is ultimately unpredictable. Sometimes Chris will only go off on a tangent on how much of a dirty troll his offenders are, and will rage, thinking that they will work as an effective way of changing their minds about conducting this behaviour that was the one responsible for angering him. Other times, Chris will absolutely despise a person's guts so much that when he orates about their dastardly deeds, he will want the person in question to either suffer or be wiped out of the face of the earth entirely. It strikes me again, ladies and gentlemen, that Chris is not a particularly very mature person, and when, for example, you do stuff like this, which is absolutely a death threat, who's to say somebody would not act out on this? And who's to say that, well, Chris would not be likely to do this himself? I mean, he sort of also does this anyway, but, well, that's for a different video. Threats. Chris sometimes will threaten his audience in an attempt to get them to do something to better themselves, or that will in some way benefit him. In the video, That Is My House, he demands all the trolls, let's just take a look at this, because I know it's like, it will prove something completely out of my own mind to say otherwise. So this is Chris trying to tell people like to take the information that he posted about his house off the internet. I know it's quite short, but this will prove the point nonetheless.
This does not even deserve a captain's log introduction, because this is dead serious. The inside and outside tour I did a few months ago of my house, everyone on the internet, my mother and my father are angry at me and blaming at me. It's my fault. I admit it's my fault. I want everything about my house off the internet. I'll send in detectives, I'll send in police, I'll send in everything in my power. So yeah, please get everything off of the internet now, 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 now. Curse the trolls. Peace to everybody else.
Now, I know what you're probably also thinking to yourselves, ladies and gentlemen, is that it's very difficult to gauge a little bit about how people are meant to take Chris seriously when he is that overexcitedly angry about this. I mean, I know it's meant to emphasize the overall seriousness of the situations, but if Chris had went for the tack that instead of like openly making a video about it, he just sought out to do it, because what's going to happen now is that more trolls and more people would have wanted to investigate about why exactly what is this information about his house that's being circulated. Meanwhile, there's also information to suggest the fact that Chris's pleas are only offset by the fact that he just demands people and screams and shouts, and he doesn't communicate it in any other way except from do as I say, and the overall validity of his voice and his tonal pitch can only be suggested of the fact that, well, like I said, he's angry and he's not particularly taking any responsibility. He's taking responsibility for the fact that I think he acknowledges that he's done wrong, but he seems to be exercising just enough of his volume and his efforts into telling people to do, well, to basically clean up his own mess. Not to mention the house. He demands all the trolls to delete everything they find out about Chris's house off the internet, and even goes as far as threatening the law onto them. Also, during the Clyde Cash saga, Chris has made several attempts to blackmail Clyde in a series of videos where he's threatening Clyde to stop trolling him. In some of these other videos, Chris tries to make Clyde look like a pathetic weakling and makes himself look like a Herculean chick magnet, while he was threatening him to have a fight with him. Bias and one-sided arguments. Chris has certain behaviours that can be seen as very stubborn. His refusal to change himself or his beliefs are often a detriment to him. This means that regardless of what evidence you give to him that suggests he's wrong, he's always will try to find some kind of information out of thin air or fallacious arguments to further verify his beliefs. Whenever he gives a speech, oftentimes he doesn't ever think about why other people might not agree with his opinions, or he won't think about the kind of people that might not benefit from his opinions. A lot of people, that's who. This seems to be a symptom of some level of narcissism, which he has developed over years of enabling by his parents. Logical fallacies. When majoring in CAD, Chris never ended up taking any classics in rhetoric, so Chris oftentimes falls into logical fallacies in his many rhetorical pieces. His arguments usually end up very unsubstantial, as a result, with no relevant evidence in many instances. The following examples illustrate the logical fallacies common to Chris's videos and speeches, and gives examples for each. Ad hominem. Chris may sometimes misguidedly rely on insults and ad hominem arguments to argue a point. This is where someone may say something, such as accusing him of being homosexual, and then Chris, instead of arguing against that point using reason, logic and guile, will insult the person's character. This is of course a fallacious method of argument and does not verify Chris's sexuality at all. For instance, in the video Kill the Jack, Chris argues that the homosexual ads are inappropriate for his website and should be replaced with something else. 2. Clyde Cash's billboards contain false information. 3. Chris is straight. However, the arguments he uses are: Jack makes Chris sick, Chris mocks Jack, Chris says Clyde is lazy, Chris appeals to an imaginary audience, saying he's not the only one sick of the ads, Chris says Jack is a snivelling coward, Chris says Jack is poor, Chris slanders Clyde and attempts to deplatform him, and then flips the bird at Jack. Not a single valid point was made. They're just running on fumes, running on emotional fumes, and they don't even land even a punch, because if Chris is, again, all Chris could have just done was contacted the system operator, found out what the situation was. If he couldn't get them removed through there, then, well, appeal to the people. You don't just string along and make threats towards them because you think that's the appropriate thing to do. Something Chris has probably never learned how to do and will continue not to know how to do till the very end of time. Straw man arguments. If Chris is arguing something outright or something airtight, he may choose to misrepresent the argument and instead argue against a malformed, flawed version of said argument created in his own mind. These were used a lot against the troll who intellectually challenged him the most, Alec Benson Leary, who wanted Chris not to use Evan Christopher George's Seamanchew character, which Chris had gender bent into Simona Rosechew. It was very hard for Alec to keep the argument on track, as Chris was so frequently using Seamanchew as a straw man, saying Evan can have his Seamanchew when Alec was clearly talking about Simona, which makes the Alec Benson Leary cause particularly hard to listen to, since Chris's incessant use of this fallacy was so annoying. Exactly as if Chris didn't seem to understand exactly what was being told and continued to lie and lie and lie. That he said he did. Moving the goalposts. Chris has had a habit of not thinking his demands through, or otherwise let his ego get in the way of reality. This will sometimes cause people to easily prove themselves correct by Chris's standard, thus winning the argument. However, in retaliation, Chris will, instead of admitting defeat, redefine the specifications and requirements of advice, or evidence, which makes the process of being proven wrong an endless cycle of being presented with evidence and demanding more. This allows Chris to believe that any of his misguided delusions are true without any allowing evidence to prove otherwise. A fantastic example of Chris's employment of this fallacy was in the Liquid Chris saga. Chris would set goals for Liquid Chris to reach to prove that he was the true and honest creator of Sonichu. And even though Liquid continually achieved these and proved that he was the true and honest creator of Sonichu, Chris would never afford him the credit he deserved. Instead, Chris would just say that the proof didn't matter because he said so, and in order for him to prove his legitimacy, he must fulfill his next goal. This is a very good example of moving the goalposts, especially since Liquid Chris didn't actually create Sonichu in the first place. The only reason Liquid could so easily fulfill Chris's demands was because they weren't asking for actual relevant evidence, but instead were egotistical assertions that he was the only person who could speak Spanish, disproven in a video by Liquid in which he shows a solid grasp of not only Spanish, but numerous other languages, or could sing. It's an incredible example of this logical fallacy, interacting with Chris's narcissism. Notable speeches from Chris. A series of commentaries on Chris's notable speeches, focusing specifically on Chris's ability to communicate body, language, and rhetoric. Christian Weston Chandler's future message. Chris's future message speech is a solid example of Chris's early oral works, featuring a lot of the problems listed in this article, and Chris's somewhat problematic beliefs. It was filmed on his 25th birthday, as a sort of set of proverbs and imparted wisdoms that Chris had accumulated through his life, that he wanted to pass to future generations. Chris was very confident and proud of this speech, as can be noted by his intention to have it shown in local schools. He has never been approached with any kind of offer for it to be displayed anywhere. Yet, although that might be for other reasons aside. Don't worry, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, we will be covering that video in a separate video of itself, but they do a good job of trying to communicate the problems. For example, Chris is holding a piece of paper on which his script is written and relies heavily on it, often neglecting to look at the camera, causing the communication to not be as effective. A better public speaker would usually try to maintain eye contact with their audience, to keep their attention and to seem personable, usually by either learning the script, knowing what they want to say and just improvising around that, placing or holding the script in a position where it can be glanced at without having to look away from the audience, or using more subtle note cards with pointers to remind them of what to say, making sure to maintain eye contact throughout. Throughout the video, the many pronunciation problems that Chris has are on full display, saying the word example as Istanbul and relaxing as relasting, as well as generally slurred speech, which is spoken too quickly to be effective. Chris also shows his regional dialect as well as his wit with the phrase, I am here and y'all are there. Interestingly enough, the hand sign Chris uses to illustrate his oration when saying that it is his 25th birthday is holding up 3 fingers. This makes the communication somewhat confusing, as a good public speaker is often sure to make sure that what they go for with their hands match up with what they are saying. Many of Chris's gestures used throughout his output are meaningless on their own, only present to convey rhythm and emphasis. Chris's stuttering is also exemplified here, when he talks faster than his brain can think, which is easy for him to do since he has a tendency to speak first or speak fast, like children usually do, and doesn't seem to have an easy time constructing sentences in his head. He says the wrong word, and often goes back a few words to say the clause again to correct the mistake. An example of this being, today I intend to share some wise words. Chris caught himself saying the wrong word and so corrects himself. The amount he does this varies heavily on how hard he finds the sentence to think of. Luckily, the script helps him know what to say if that happens, so it doesn't happen as much in this particular video. The parts where he stutters, most of it where he goes off script and makes a side comment such as, I haven't done it and I don't like it, doing either of them. Rhetorical problems. Chris usually uses a litany of rhetorical devices to put across his points, such as calling cigarettes death sticks, and saying he would like to send all the tobacco that exists to the moon on a rocket. Chris also takes a negative stance on alcohol, saying that it's a slow-acting poison. However, these arguments somewhat fall flat when he uses himself as an example of the benefits of not smoking or drinking, fit as a fiddle. When Chris is indeed not dead or suffering liver problems, he isn't exactly a portrait of good health. Being unfit and overweight at 25, The use of good examples is extremely important in rhetoric and public speaking in general. If Chris let go of his ego, he'd be better off citing straight-edge celebrities. Chris also speaks out against gender transitioning and intimate relations with the same gender. Unfortunately, this argument doesn't have much to stand on, as Chris merely makes a somewhat feeble and lazy appeal to authorities by invoking the name of Dr. Alfred Kinsley, a 1950s sex researcher. He also mentions the big man upstairs, presumably referring to the Christian God, which Chris believes or believed in at the time, since Christian marriage is between a man and a woman and premarital sex is prohibited, making same-sex relations a sin in general. He also claims homosexuality can really jeopardize the entire future of the world and the human race, which is complete untrue and baseless, since LGBTQ+ people are in the minority and can still reproduce through surrogacy. None of these arguments are good or well supported enough to be taken seriously. I mean, you could also make the case that the video was made such a long time ago, all the way back in 2007, which is again, even 17 years ago, that's not particularly an exceptional amount of time ago. And it's not exactly as if, surrogacy was just a thing that came about 10 years ago. It's been around for a very long time, and many people have been working round the clock to see, if people can still produce multiple offspring without needing to engage in coitus whatsoever. So I don't exactly understand why Chris is so... If Chris had been around perhaps maybe in 1907 as opposed to 2007, Chris might have had a slightly larger following for different reasons, but this is not the case. Chris insists that women not be so picky when it comes to finding a partner, as well as this showing that Chris seeks to undermine female agency and self-esteem. It also is a transparent attempt to get women to have a relationship with him, out of pity. This is an abuse of his platform as a public speaker and really undermines a lot of his points. Chris could improve his public speaking a lot by becoming more humble and respectful of other people's wishes, and unfortunately did not manage to provide good enough citations for his points. In conclusion, we can see from this example that both Chris's ability to communicate and rhetoric discourse is ultimately flawed, and will require a lot more speech therapy and communication training, as well as rhetoric lessons to control. The Autism Tutorial. Chris's autism tutorial is a good example of Chris lecturing a large group of people on a widespread mental disorder, but without researching the subject correctly or using effective techniques in his points. It also displays rage responses and insult responses, so you can get a wide range of these techniques. In most of this video series, Chris neglects to actually talk about autism, its effects on one's cognitive functioning, how neurotypicals should treat people on the autism spectrum, and seldom gives appropriate or recommended advice. When he isn't telling parents of autistic children to mainstream their kids and irrationally hating on a part of the spectrum, he is giving very incoherent and convoluted speeches. Here are just a few of his speeches he gives in the video series. Fellow autistic people, I encourage you to man and woman up. Subtitle, It is Socializing in Real Life or Dust, respectively. Go out into the real world and make real friends with full, great quality friendships. Do it now. In this speech, Chris doesn't seem to account for people who are much lower on the spectrum and therefore can't socialize with others like he demands them to. He also doesn't seem to grasp the idea that all autistic people develop differently, hence why it is called a spectrum in the first place. Because of this, despite being somewhat incompetent at socializing himself, he thinks that if he just acts as a role model and tells all autistic people to go out and just talk to people, their disorder will magically become manageable. I feel dislike towards you for selfishly putting your ill name in association with autism. And with a name like Asperger, I feel it only makes us autistic kind sound even worse. Asperger's. You should have left it as it was. Autism is autism. And in your research, you linked it up with psychopaths. I feel even more offended at that. Now get out of my sight. Due to his lack of research on Hans Asperger's contribution to the understanding of autism, him twisting and cherry-picking what he did find out about Hans's research, and him failing to realize that Hans was autistic himself, which, again, you have to understand as well, that, yes, a lot of people do say Hans Asperger was still a Nazi, all things being as they are, and you may be asking yourselves why exactly the Nazis, among other things, would want to permit the existence of people with autism to exist, is a particularly interesting question in itself. But I also want to point out, ladies and gentlemen, is that Hans Asperger was probably very useful in the representation of documentation and evidence towards Adolf Hitler and to the Nazi Party. And I know this might blow a lot of people's minds when I say this, but guess what? There were some people who were Nazis or those who were serving under Hitler's Third Reich who didn't actually like the things that they did. You know, the only reason why people fell in line with the Gestapo was basically out of fear, not of actual any real legitimate love or loyalty to the party. I know, again, this sounds like one of those things that didn't need to be said, but it stands to reason. You know what? Hans Asperger was not Johann Ribbentrop, is what I'm trying to say. Or Herr Goering, or Herr Goebbels. You know what I'm trying to say? There is a very distinctive difference in these sorts of people. If I did a video about Hans Asperger as well, I would probably imagine it would probably be more associated with Hans Asperger rather than my opinions about Adolf Hitler's Third Reich, but that's besides the point. Due to his lack of research, okay, so we went through that, Chris seems to view Hans as the culprit behind his and other autistics' lack of appreciation from anyone, simply for naming a condition after himself, and having it sound like Asperger's. In his juvenile mind, also somewhat failing to realize that Asperger's is only a part of the spectrum and not another name for it, and therefore takes great offense at it for no real reason. No way, imposter. Sorry about that. This public message from Chris is aimed primarily at Liquid Chris, but is also a message to the wider public and companies who Chris seems to think that could stop Liquid Chris from selling merchandise, when it's unlikely that they would even take his side. Chris employs a number of tendencies mentioned in this page throughout the video, but obviously none more prevalent than threats and blind hatred. Chris notably babbles and stutters a lot less when making this video than some of his more relaxed orations, but can have some serious problems when his mind wanders or has particular trouble with a sentence. A notable example of Chris having a stuttering problem is at the 046 section, where an attempt to use staccato-like phrasing to get across his point powerfully, it seems to have backfired as he forgets which order the words are meant to be in. Stop that brown striped in the shirt with the paper medallion. Threats and ad hominems. Chris throughout this video is very impassioned and aroused, and is neither subtle nor eloquent. His performance style involves a lot of hand-waving, raised voices, and lots of threats and insults. This first makes the threat of suing Liquid. This is assuming that he has grounds to sue, and for that he would need more than the copyright registration of Electric Files, named Sonichu. Other than the very empty threat of legal issues, Chris also makes a very vague death threat in the form of "die you," and also attempts to use black magic to put a curse on Liquid Chris. Now, what I decided I wanted to do actually is that we're going to actually do sort of like a part 2 to this video. So there's going to be one in theory and there's going to be one in practice. So make sure to see that. We'll be able to see Chris in the wild. It should come as no surprise that merely yelling "you are the imposter" is not a valid argument, and is simply used as the intimidation tactic to get Liquid to voluntarily stop selling Sonichu merchandise. But Chris seems to believe that Liquid can and should go to jail for his actions, although "die you" is technically a death threat, it is very unlikely that Chris will make an attempt on Liquid's life, and doesn't even seem to really be threatening to do so. Just telling him to die is a little too vague. False equivalencies. Chris, in his oration, uses false equivalency liberally in his rhetoric, causing many confusing moments and points. The first being his copyright on Sonichu, which is not a trademark, is a grounds to sue Liquid. Adamantly, it is generally accepted that Chris is too naive to realize that he has no legal grounds to make such a threat, but it is a false equivalency nonetheless. The second false equivalency is that Chris having sent Nintendo a letter and giving them over $5,000 means that Nintendo know who Chris is and will be willing to stop Liquid from selling Sonichu merchandise. The third false equivalency is that the true creator of Sonichu is the one with his address, his phone number, and his parents. This also counts as a circular argument, by the way, so that's a double logical fallacy. The fourth is somewhat similar to the second, but Chris also claims that the company of Nintendo had known him his whole lifetime because he bought stuff from them. Chris even claims that Nintendo would kick Liquid out. The fifth false equivalency is that Liquid should have the police called on him by companies or his fanbase and thrown in jail to rot, even though it is very unlikely that Liquid would ever make enough money to get life in jail by selling Sonichu merchandise. Activism. Being an opinionated and even confrontational person around the subjects that he is very passionate about, Chris has engaged in many campaigns on many platforms that are available. Chris has been observed to conduct activism for a number of subjects, from local issues about saving McIntyre Park to international issues about Sonic's arm color. Chris is proactive about protecting the things he loves, except Sonichu. Twitter campaigns. Twitter is one of the many public platforms that Chris uses as his soapbox to speak to the world. The 280 character limit can't stop Chris, as he'll sometimes make a thread which is a longer speech comprised of many linked tweets. These are used especially preeminently in his Twitter campaigns. In these, he will use his platform to deliver rhetorical pieces on certain issues he is rallying behind. These are mostly triggered by trolling, being blocked, or because someone hasn't followed his orders, no matter if it's an individual or a company. Hashtag harass Quick directly. On the 1st of August 2017, Chris made a post for International Girlfriend Day, where he gathered up all of the gal pals he had made on Twitter. In this particular post, he tagged Planet Dolan voice actress and artist Doopy Doover, whose Twitter posts Chris replied to on a regular basis. Doopy, seemingly unsettled by Chris's possible labelling of her as a gal pal and using the pet name Darling, made it clear to Chris that she is a stranger to him and that he should back off. Despite this obvious message, Chris took it to meaning that Doopy won't befriend Chris because of her influence with the trolls, rather than because of his inappropriate behaviour. Chris then came to the conclusion that Doopy wanted to stay away from him because his trolls were supposedly harassing her and the rest of the Planet Dolan crew. Chris, upset that the trolls were supposedly trolling his new girlfriend, or friend I should say, created the hashtag campaigns harass Quick directly and don't harass me. The next day, to direct all of the trolls that were trolling Doopy to him, and even made a video scolding the trolls for harassing other people for their enjoyment because of Doopy eventually blocking him, Chris retired the hashtag on the 4th of August 2017. Hashtag block the trolls. On the 28th of August 2017, after being stressed out by his conversation with Lady of the Cosmo, Chris, thinking he is no way responsible for the bad things that happened to him, for a further story see the article Chris and Kindness, made a post regarding how the trolls have recently made him feel off. After making this post, he made a long-winded speech about how good should rule over the world that over the evil that is the trolls. He eventually followed the Twitter hashtag block the trolls. His arguments mostly consisted of false equivalencies. He compared himself to a hero, defending the Twitter user he liked, attempting to invoke emotion by naming heroes like Sailor Moon and Optimus Prime. In reality, Chris was more like an affectionate and enthusiastic dog with fleas coming into someone's house, and getting very confused and angry when he was thrown out. Chris is confused about why he would be rejected, when the person could just comb all the fleas out. But the fleas reproduce and get everywhere, and Chris simply isn't worth keeping. This gaping flaw in his argument causes the speech to fall flat, resulting in 80% of people voting in a poll he made that it was the correct choice just to block Chris, as it is easier. The My Little Pony protests. On the 13th of August 2018, after Hasbro announced that their popular children's show My Little Pony would end their 4th generation TV show, Friendship is Magic, and proceed onto a 5th generation, Chris, believing that he had prophesied that there would be 5 more seasons of Friendship is Magic, started protesting against it. His rhetoric here is frankly awful. Not only is he appealing to authority, but he's appealing to his own authority. As a CPU and also an all-powerful goddess, however, Chris thought that this was a very good argument, and it would be if he actually was an all-powerful being, but unfortunately Hasbro has yet to respond to this protest. Some examples of poor rhetoric include, I have seen a future that we must prevent, My Little Pony Generation 5, nobody will take this level of reasoning seriously, I just did a reset to prevent that from happening, you aren't able to rewrite the canon of a TV show by saying something, and it is frankly ridiculous that Chris thinks that he should have this level of power in his fictional universe. CPU Blueheart commands it as so as well, in agreement with Princess Celestia, appeal to the authority of an OC and a character that Hasbro created, neither of whom exist, and reboots hurt the original very bad. Reboots stunts growth of the original. More baseless and factually incorrect information, note that Chris uses the words hurt and growth here in the sense of affecting of a living being, not just the reboots of shows made the original worse. And besides, if Chris was really that bad, it should be worth pointing out to Chris that, Generation 4, Friendship is Magic, the show isn't going anywhere, it's just finished. But the show does still exist, it's ran its course, and it ran from 2010 to 2019. So I don't exactly understand why Chris felt that this. I don't understand his logic. Let's just put it like that. Facebook campaigns. Before Chris started using Twitter as his main platform, Chris used Facebook as his public platform. In the months and years after he stopped making YouTube videos as much as when Bob died, Chris, using this platform, started a few campaigns about the things he was very concerned with at this time in his life, in the early Tongue stages. The Sonic Boom protests. In late 2014, it was revealed that the latest iteration of Sonic, Sonic Boom, would depict Sonic as having blue arms, as opposed to the usual tan colour, which was integral to Sonic's iconic design. Despite the non-canon nature of this game and series, Chris took serious issues with the nature of the redesign. Chris wrote letters and took physical actions during his campaign, but also conducted a campaign on Facebook. In his speeches, Chris will often use capital letters to portray shouting. These parts are often where he is at his most rhetorically inept. For example, this is an example of why Chris says Sega should waste lots of money on a recall of the whole Sonic Boom franchise. Sonic's arms are not blue, and they seriously cause sensory overloads in me. Chris calls for boycotts and mass calling campaigns among the masses to get Sega to recall the franchise, and if you're not sure whether or not Chris is calling for this and expects Sega to comply explicitly because he doesn't like it, this is what he recommends people say. The very sight of Sonic's blue arms makes our ally, Christian Weston Chandler of Ruckersville, Virginia, suffer from consistent sensory overloads. Upon seeing them, his brain immediately shuts down into a momentary to lengthy, depending on how long he is forced to displeasingly endure this horrific sight, state of mental paralysis. Yes, Chris thought and expected that everyone was angry about the colour of Sonic's arm because specifically he didn't like it. It doesn't seem to matter to him whether other people liked it or not, and this has an extremely negative effect on his rhetoric and ability to communicate. This position of severe narcissism often alienates Chris's audience in his speeches. This, and Chris's tendency to issue death threats, eventually caused him to be thrown out of his own Facebook group. After starting a new Facebook group, Keep Sonic's Arms Original, Sega! These alienating and polarizing speeches it's Fix Sonic's Arms Immediately, Sega! Caused Chris to be pushed back by those who agree that Sonic's arms should stay tan, eventually calling the campaign a success when in the next Sonic game his arms went back to tan, despite this not being the goal of the campaign. Okay, brassieres for males. In mid to late 2013, Chris created a Facebook page on which to campaign about making brassieres socially acceptable and encouraged for men to wear. Chris, while not really giving a very good reason for wanting to do so, Chris does, however, show his best display of rhetoric throughout his campaigns, presumably due to the help of somebody else. His reasoning and thought process are well set out and developed, thanks to the page's administrators, who are helping Chris's arguments becoming more well put. For example, the original About page was very well considered and offered many convincing reasons that it should be socially acceptable, such as sports bras prevent chafing commonly experienced by joggers, bras can provide support and relief for the wearer's chest and back, some conditions cause male to develop larger breasts, which is often a cause of embarrassment, bras designed for males, or sports bras in the appropriate size can flatten or lessen the appearance of male breasts and help the wearer feel more confident. Many males wear undershirts to accomplish this purpose, often with suboptimal results. Some males enjoy wearing brassieres as an expression of gender or sexual identity. Though this is a valid issue, it is not the focus of this page. Anyone who wants to wear a bra for whatever reason should be free to do so. This very well thought out and thought-provoking set of reasons was almost certainly not said by Chris, but it is a good backdrop on which to contrast the direction in which Chris takes the page once the administrators stop controlling him as much as Chris uses some of his fallacies and confusing diction. For instance, this quote, which is extremely bewildering: Ryan Gosling wears a man bra. Okay, so maybe he doesn't, but we can't know for sure. Rather than appealing to people that social acceptance of men wearing bras is a good thing, he's merely asserting that it is socially acceptable already by appealing to authority, and then suggesting that we can't know for sure the means we should consider it as acceptable already. That's 3 fallacies in a very short passage. In late 2014, when the page was picked back up by Chris after a long hiatus, Chris didn't have the administrators to help him at all, and so quickly developed into something vastly different, and didn't last very long, proving that the campaign was really over by this point. He came out as transsexual and told men that they should wear skirts as well as bras. These arguments weren't quite as well formulated. In the comics. At some points in the comics, many of the characters will give a speech regarding their opinions on the current situation. Other times, Chris will use these same comics to write speeches of his own. The comics turn out to be a very good source for learning about Chris's orating skills. Chris will often display many of the rhetoric devices outlined in this page, favouring distortions of reality that suggest that people he doesn't like are worse than they really are, and that he is more virtuous than he actually is. He uses a lot of ad hominems, which merely serve to make Chris appear to be a more vindictive and egotistical character than he would like his readers to believe. For example, towards the end of episode 17 in Sonichu issue 8, Sonichu gives a speech about how Jason Kendrick Howell is not only triggering Chris by giving Rosechew a pickle, but how doing so somehow also drags both of his and other United States citizens through the mud, even though Rosechew is not a political figure. This is an example of Chris using false equivalence to put the point across that it is immoral and illegal to portray Rosechew in this way. Chris also uses a rhetorical question which uses heavy extrapolation to imply that disagree with him is a dishonor to the country. Chris is also using a false appeal to patriotism because drawing art of a fictional character has no bearing on the United States, and his attempt to suggest it does is disingenuous. It's a bit like that one time when 4Kids were still a big thing, and they had a lot of the characters that were sort of like in their property as far as like dubbing was concerned and distribution in the US. They would have likes of Sonic, Ash Ketchum, and quite a lot of others try to sing "Oh Say Can You See." Chris occasionally will lose focus and go off on quite drastic, jarring tangents by providing extensive exposition about something. This really ruins the flow of his speeches and makes the point less poignant and punchy. No pun intended. Ultimately, pacing suffers a lot in the speeches of Sonichu due to these errors. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is only really part one of discussing Chris's oration skills, because these are just things that we know just through evidence suggested. What I want to do next time, ladies and gentlemen, is Chris's oration skills as proven in practice, which will mean that we'll have to go through several videos at a time. Several ones in which Chris is trying to make a strong case and point, and others in which Chris wants to voice something that he is passionate about. Because there's a lot of... It would be good to also just discuss about the way Chris conducts his videos generally, I suppose, as well, when it comes to like his camera, his cinematography, sound. There's a lot of things to like go over, but for now, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've just about covered the vast majority of things we wanted to do. And, well, since we do have a little bit more time, there is something I did want to show you guys. I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but I'm going to need us to go over some context for this, ladies and gentlemen. So, about five years ago, when I started doing YouTube, I was about 4 or maybe even 5 months into doing my stuff on YouTube the first time, and I was openly asking if there were metal bands that were basically brand new or up and coming, and whether I could, if they wanted to request me to check out their stuff. And one group in particular that stood out, because they just mentioned it almost through passing in the comment section, was this band Methane. And what these guys did, let me just tell you what these guys did. I checked out their stuff, and I didn't ask them to do this. These guys did it of their own volition. Is that they made a video where they checked out. They actually wanted to hear my opinions about what I did for them. Because back in the day, I was very, very open. I was using a veritable smorgasbord of really big words. And I was constantly like flailing my hands and trying to say they were this and they were... I was very, very open and very, very animated in a very linguistic sort of sense. And just to give you an idea, because we won't watch all of it, we'll watch like some of it, just to give you an idea of like sort of just what I was back in 2019, but what these guys had to say as well, because it's kind of interesting, is since a lot of my videos have like, well, mostly through this channel, there's been a lot more people like seeing what I've had to say. It's interesting as well, the opinions people have had about me through what I talk about in relation to Chris, as well as Daniel Larson. So, yeah, that's... Oh, God, this is a blast from the past, if you ask me.
You're coming. Tell your friends. Today, I contacted a guy on YouTube who does reactions, and I just left a message on his comments there. Do you take submissions from bands? And he started rattling off reactions to our stuff, and I gotta tell you,
yeah, also that was like a really big thing I did all the way back in the beginning, is that I would literally do like nearly 10 videos a day, and I was still at university when this was going on as well.
This guy, there's no words for this guy. He is a king of reactions.
Oh yeah.
Amazing. I love him. I want to drink beer with this guy. I want to eat alligator.
Oh yeah.
I want to... It's just incredible. Now we're going to do our own reaction to his reactions.
Yeah, I know somebody has said this about my stuff already, but almost... somebody said I was like the Jordan Peterson of doing like locales, and maybe I was possibly also the Jordan Peterson of doing like metal songs as well. But oh god, yeah, oh god, no. Oh,
and let's
no.
see
Here
what
it
comes up. And then we'll see what happens. Now, I never did this before.
no.
I've never seen this before. You ever seen this before?
No.
A reaction to a reaction.
No.
Before you guys watch this, you have to have your sunglasses on. Just warning you now.
Oh god.
For your own safety. All right, let's look at it.
No. Okay, no. I can't do this. No. Oh god, no. This is weird. Oh god. Okay. Oh god. Oh god. No, I don't even know. Okay, let's do it.
Hello, YouTube, and welcome.
Oh god, the audio's terrible. Oh god, oh no. Oh god, I picked the. Oh god. Oh no, look at me. Oh god. This is like oh.
Welcome back to another raging with horses running about all over the place.
Okay, that's it. No. You know what? I've had enough. I'm not even gonna go there anymore. Okay, listen, guys. Okay, if you guys want to check this out, I don't even know why I've even had the subscribe button yet. There we go. May as well have liked it as well. If you want to actually hear what I had to say about this, because I can't do it. No, this is like This is terrible. And but I'll skip ahead. I'll just get to what they had to say for what it's worth. If you disagree, by the way, if you think my opinions aren't worth anything, just check it out from these guys. They'll say it better than I can, I guess.
Is a king.
This guy, he has just so many ways to describe our music. You know, with the wildlife thing, with the horses, and with the barbecue. I don't know. He's just.
I'm getting vibes. Captain Caveman down in Texas, our DJ friend down there, man. He's got the horses and the barbecues, and
yeah. Well, I suppose I've toned down. I'd say I've toned. Okay, we'll discuss this later. I'm not doing this more. I think I've took up most of your time. So I'll catch all of you guys later. Okay. What can I say? Leaves me screaming for vengeance.